Hi, it's my real pleasure to welcome Professor Erica Field. She's a professor at Duke University and an expert in health economics. She's done work in a wide range of countries, from Zambia to Pakistan to, I think, Peru. So, she's expert on many things. And I'm really excited to hear her talk today about a signal to end child marriage. I just wanted to remind you all that it's totally fine to unmute to ask questions. Professor Field will not be offended. So if you have questions, just feel free to unmute and ask them. All right. Erica, I'm going to throw it to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Natalie. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me to come present this paper today. This is joint work with Nina Buckman and Rachel Glenister, Shahana Nazneen, and Xiaoyu Wang. And the paper, oh, 1 second, having trouble forwarding. Okay. So the paper tries to understand motivations for child marriage in Bangladesh. Just as background, child marriage is an extremely prevalent concern in much of the world. An estimated 700 million women alive today were married underage, under the legal age of 18. And Bangladesh is an outlier among countries. It currently has the highest rate of marriage, of very underage marriage, girls under 15, an estimated 39% of women ages 20 to 49 married under the age of 15. And this is especially puzzling for two reasons. First, this is in spite of demographic trends that should be expected to exert negative pressure on the demand for young brides. Girls' schooling and women's labor market participation has gone up significantly over the past couple decades. Fertility is down, child mortality is down. And at the same time, you've seen changing strong trends in attitudes towards underage marriage. There have been a lot of campaigns throughout Bangladesh trying to raise awareness about the dangers of underage childbearing and kind of put social pressure on families to change these patterns. And so that makes it especially difficult to understand why we see such persistent rates of child marriage in this particular setting. This in general would be seen to be kind of inconsistent with a very simple stylized model in which you have a strong youth premium or a strong cultural preference for underage marriage. In that case, you would kind of see as the opportunity cost of marrying young goes up, you would expect to see marriage age also kind of steadily increasing over the period. And instead, this is just a picture of demographic trends alongside trends in marriage age or underage marriage, which is the top line in blue, between 2004 and 2017 from the demographic and health surveys. And you can see while between 2004 and 2007, there was a slight decline in the rate of underage marriage. It's been very, very constant between 2007 and even now, 2020. And yet the fraction of girls who complete secondary school has gone, has increased substantially from, almost none in 2004 from, to 15, I guess 17.5%. And kind of an analogous motivation is that worldwide, underage marriage has shown to be very difficult to change with existing policy approaches. And so almost every country in the world now has an age of consent law at age 18 that have been shown to be empirically very ineffective in changing marriage age in developing countries. Girls' schooling programs are often tied to no marriage rules. And these have been shown to have a small effect on marriage age, but clearly only for those girls that are reaching secondary school. So they're kind of exclusive policies in terms of potential impact. Girls' empowerment programs, which I'll talk more about in this talk, are now a kind of standard policy instrument for addressing what are believed to be cultural preferences like child marriage by attempting to promote more progressive gender norms. And those have not been shown to change marriage age. And so what we try to do in this paper is to formalize and then test one specific reason that child marriage might persist even when preferences for young brides are dying out or changing, and that is signaling considerations. And what we posit and try to show with this model is that signaling considerations do have the potential to influence choice over marriage timing if the following two conditions hold. First, that the dominant bride characteristic in the marriage market, so the kind of type of bride that's most preferred in this setting, is one that's not perfectly observed by potential grooms. So that it gives rise to the potential for there to be signaling considerations. And also that this characteristic is negatively correlated with the returns to education. And what we argue is that there is a lot of kind of reason to believe that especially in South Asia, both of these conditions are likely to hold in the marriage market because one of the, and possibly the dominant bride characteristic in the marriage market is women's adherence to traditional gender norms, including docility, obedience to husbands and in-laws, just social conservatism more generally, and kind of any adherence to any norms of behavior that protect a family's reputation. And there is a large anthropological literature that kind of motivated this assumption, but it's also one that we see evidence of in survey data that we collected from husbands in our survey sample, husbands of girls that participated in our data collection and interventions in Bangladesh, in which we were asked them to report kind of the two most important characteristics of women they were considering marrying. And, you know, obviously there are a lot of ways to interpret these kind of responses. It might not even be the case that we can trust people to report accurately about their preferences. But what we do see is, again, this, you know, kind of pattern of reports that is consistent with what has been posited in the existing literature, which is that what matters most when considering a bride in an arranged marriage market, in which there's not a lot of information about potential spouses in either direction, is a girl's reputation, her nature, her adherence to tradition. What I haven't put up on the slides is that looks very different when you ask women about potential grooms. And there you see income and earning capacity being by far the dominant characteristic. It's kind of the equivalent of looks and nature combined. And what you also see here is that there is no stated preference for age. Age doesn't appear to be kind of an important consideration when deciding, who to marry.
Erica, is that because everybody's the same age?
There are a lot of.
It's just a strong norm at marriage at a certain age, so it's effectively not a choice variable.
That may well be what's explaining some of those patterns. And so I don't want this to be considered kind of hard evidence, just a consistency check. These were open-ended responses, and kind of then classified them with the enumerator, kind of categorized them into existing boxes, but they were for the most part free responses. So you're absolutely right. So we argue that it's the case that certainly this characteristic is not perfectly observed. So supposing that you do care about adherence to gender norms more than anything else, it might be observed, there might be some indicators of how conservative a potential bride is, but it's certainly not going to be perfectly observed. Our empirical evidence of that, which we take from survey data that we collected on girls' norms and attitudes, from which we constructed an index of conservatism towards gender norms in particular, is that, first of all, girls' norms differ substantially from that of her older siblings and parents. And so that's kind of additional evidence that it's not something that one is going to be able to infer very well in this kind of arranged marriage market. And there's also just in general wide variation among this one cohort of girls that we track in the marriage market in terms of their own social preferences. So they're relatively conservative girls and relatively kind of more socially progressive girls in terms of gender norms. And I should also, well, I'll say more about the marriage market, but this is a marriage market in which people are marrying across villages, across families. And so it's, relatively, people are relatively more or less strangers at the time of marriage. I think it's also easy to argue that this particular characteristic is likely to be negatively correlated with returns to education. And that is because labor market participation, you can see in the data, varies strongly with social conservatism. And it's also the, even non-labor market returns to education are likely to matter less, or likely to vary with a girl's adherence to norms, just because socially conservative women are much less likely to participate in household decision-making. And so you could think that, if you have less control over household resources, then education is going to matter. The returns to education are lower within the family. And so the key implications of this, of signaling considerations in the marriage market, are that signaling introduces the possibility that all women marry young, either to reveal or to hide their type, depending on which type they are, even if all men and all women prefer to delay marriage. So even if we've entered even if preferences have changed in Bangladesh such that no one, as they say in survey data, wants to marry underage, they still might, just because of the signaling value of revealing that you're a desirable type. And what that means for social welfare is that there could be inefficiently high and also, very sticky rates of child marriage. And so in other words, reducing child marriage under these conditions could be Pareto improving, which is important for kind of justifying interventions in what otherwise might be kind of a deeply held cultural preference. It also means for policy purposes that potentially a very small incentive, financial incentive, is required to induce women to marry later. So it might not take much to undo current patterns or the current equilibrium of child marriage. First of all, the incentive doesn't have to be offered to everyone. If we're in a signaling environment, then an incentive offered to a subset of people inside a community can trigger spillover effects on other people's behavior. So that makes it kind of cost effective for a financial incentive to reduce child marriage rates. And it's also just a lower amount is required. You need people to coordinate on a new equilibrium. And because there's going to be inherent value to everyone of waiting, because everyone inherently wants women to get more educated and marry later, then less money is required to compensate those that you pay directly. And the second implication of a signaling environment is that an intervention that tries directly to change traditional gender norms, such as the empowerment programs that I mentioned briefly earlier, might actually have a perverse effect on marriage behavior, because what you're doing in those programs, one way of interpreting what those programs do is attempt to reduce adherence to traditional gender norms, to convince girls to adopt more progressive gender norms. In a signaling model, in doing that, you essentially could encourage marriage, because the signaling value, the value of signaling that you're a preferred type, an obedient, a traditional girl, is going to increase as the fraction of the population that is not increases. And so that, suggests that empowerment programs may be much less effective than a simple financial incentive. Now, importantly, these predictions are unique to the signaling model relative to kind of this, a number of different other models you might write down of marriage, of preferences for age or marriage timing patterns. And that allows us to test them empirically with a field experiment, which we run in rural Bangladesh. It is an RCT of two alternative child marriage policies. The first is a relatively, I think it's a kind of a completely novel conditional incentive program, which is a small financial incentive offered to the parents of adolescent girls that's conditional only on marriage age. So not on any other, not school enrollment or any other behavior of the girl. And then we also, run that program alongside a very standard empowerment curriculum offered to girls of the same age in a different set of villages. That, and the curriculum involves material designed to discourage traditional gender norms of behavior, encourage women to increase their aspirations for employment, and promote agency in general. And just to give you a preview of the results, what we find is that the financial incentive did indeed reduce the rate of underage marriage, both for women who were directly offered the incentive, but also for, we observe spillover effects on those around them. And the effects are large. So we see a reduction in marriage age under 18 of 20% among girls that were eligible for the incentive, and a significant reduction on those living nearby the incentive villages who are not directly eligible for the incentive. And so this, you can kind of see here, I haven't gone into any detail on the model, but I think it's fairly intuitive. It's kind of inconsistent with social preferences if you will reduce your marriage age when given the opportunity to, when kind of given an excuse for marrying later. That is, so girls who don't directly get any financial compensation also marry later when given the opportunity. And what's important also is that these spillovers are only observed among the non-preferred types. Those are the less socially conservative girls, which is not well observed in our data. They're the ones who kind of free ride on this program when they're given the opportunity. So we see that's kind of the, what
could you give us a sense?
Our model.
I'm sorry, could you give us a sense of how big the incentives are relative to, relative to income or annual income or daily, weekly income or something?
Yeah, so these, the incentives are going to be on the roughly $15 US dollars a year. And we're talking about a setting in which, $400 per year is going to be the income that you would compare it to. And so these are small, small in those terms. Who's to say? I think the right way to think about it is relative to dowry. Well, one other comparison one might make is relative to dowry. And so dowry, these numbers are going to come up in the slides in a minute, is, I think it's about the same as annual income. So it's, I mean, you'll see these numbers. I'm worried that I misspoke a little bit, but that's the right order of magnitude.
Erica, okay, can I ask? You go ahead, Donald, sorry.
No, I'm finished. Thanks.
I mean, I think you're right that the amount alone, it's small. It's smaller than one might expect, but of course, you could have that the youth premium valued at anything. So maybe that happens to be exactly what it takes. So I think the spillover effects are more clear evidence that we're not just compensating people for something they'd rather not do.
Erica, can you give me a sense about how to think about this in relation to the Baird and McIntosh and somebody I'm forgetting, Ertzler maybe, paper that's the follow-up in Kenya where they did the conditional versus unconditional cash transfers of girls to school, right? And they found that it delayed marriage until the thing ended, right? But by that point, there was like changes in the marriage matching market because all the good husbands or whatever had been taken so it just delayed everybody that was in the program, but not anybody else, right? So this seems like exactly the opposite.
So why is,
or is there something I'm thinking about the setup wrong, like the context or?
Yeah, so I mean, one issue, so I don't actually think that a signaling model is necessarily based on, I wouldn't extrapolate to that setting our results. I think there are key differences. Maybe the most important one, these will come out in kind of in the background, but I think the most important differences are, first of all, this is a setting of arranged marriage in which girls have very little choice over who they marry. And so it's parent to parent. Their results are going to be based on, I think it's actually on extramarital childbearing, not marriage itself. And so we're talking about choices over which one has a lot of agency, deciding. And so I think, the effects, so that is a key, difference that I think is going to be important in terms of making predictions. But so maybe I'm not, so
like, yeah, they had that follow-up paper. I don't know if you saw it. It was like not that long ago that it finally came out. I don't know when it was. We had
a version of it, but probably maybe not necessarily the most recent. So I mean, I don't think one needs to reconcile these two things. I mean, they're very different programs. And so I guess I'm also not saying, maybe I was a little too dismissive on the previous slide. I think if you do incentivize girls to go to school, you will in many settings get a change in marriage age. Just only among a subset of girls that are on the margin of influence for that. They were working with a set of girls that were enrolled in secondary school. So that is one way in which you can achieve that. I think would be kind of the most straightforward answer. Whether or not that's more cost effective is something that I think we have pretty good evidence that this can be more cost effective than that, but they're obviously in very different settings. And so I'm a little bit reluctant to, if you do the back of the envelope calculation, which maybe I'll get to, maybe like ours is a more cost-effective approach to that. And it's also, again, has greater reach in terms of who is potentially affected. But those are kind of, I guess, the two ways one might sort of compare those two programs. But conditional, I guess the other thing I could try to say is in our setting, in a signaling world, what exactly would an incentive conditional on schooling do? And let me think a little bit more about that. But I guess we don't want to rule out that would work, only that this is going to be more cost effective, and that the implications on who's affected differ quite a bit. But so I don't think our results are inconsistent, I guess, as with theirs. And so in another important pattern of results is that and this also relates to what they find, is that the dowry and the husband quality are unchanged, which is suggestive of kind of no marriage market penalty to delaying. Again, if you have a model in which you're not changing people's preferences, people want to marry young, there are all sorts of motivations people might have for marrying their daughters young, such as safety, or you can think of many reasons why that might persist. But if it's just that kind of preferences for youth in the marriage market, then if you pay people to delay, then you are either going to, weekly both increase the dowry, meaning to achieve the same husband quality, given that they're marrying later, they're going to have to pay more, or they're going to pay less and not pay more and end up with a worse match on the marriage market. And we don't see evidence of that happening. So that's kind of, again, inconsistent with compensating for a preference for youth. And then I guess, I think I took this out because my presentation was so long, but it's also just the case that people don't express any preference for youth. If you ask parents, if you ask girls, if you ask boys, what's the ideal marriage, age of your daughter, of you, of your potential bride, it's all over 18. In fact, the average, minimum age of marriage is 20. People really, don't express in survey data when asked any aspiration to marry young, marry their daughters young, or marry a young bride. In fact, this is very qualitative evidence, but it's kind of like, I really would love my daughter to finish school, but unfortunately the dowry is going to go up so much I can't afford it. Why would it go up? Well, because people infer something bad about the girl if she waits too long. It's really this kind of unfortunate situation in which we all want more education for our daughters. We all want her to have kids later. This is the kind of qualitative work that we discussed a little bit in the paper, but that really kind of convinced us that something much more complicated was going on. And then meanwhile, we evaluate the impact of the empowerment program and find that while girls do adopt significantly more progressive gender norms, we see no change in marriage patterns. That is, there are many reasons that might happen, but it is consistent with our story in which you would get kind of more pressure on, or more concern about marrying a progressive girl, because the issue here is very simple. It's if people like docility in a bride and you go and empower a bunch of girls, then and you haven't changed society's preference for brides, then you're not going to change marriage age. In fact, you might even put more pressure on marrying young.
So Erica, just to be clear, so then the spillover effects which you detected are those who among girls which at baseline were more socially progressive.
Yeah. Okay, so the interpretation we give to these patterns is that the signaling environment exacerbates child marriage in the setting. It makes standard empowerment programs less likely to work. Again, you could have empowerment programs that try to change preferences over the type of bride that's preferred. And I don't know how easy that would be to do, but that's not what is typically done now. But it does increase, the signaling environment is good in the sense that it increases the potential for a relatively small financial incentive to have a large effect on child marriage. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Bangladesh. Since I've been working in the setting for a while. So this is a nearly universal system of arranged marriage. Parents negotiate a marriage contract between their sons and daughters. In general, girls, and even I know less about this because I've collected data from a lot more girls and women than men and boys, but my sense is that girls and even boys have relatively little agency in marriage decisions. In fact, in Bangladesh, it's fairly extreme. A huge fraction of marriages are negotiated by a third party, not just between parents, but there's actually a third party matchmaker involved who's professional, and that they receive as compensation a fraction of the amounts that they negotiate in the contract. It's a setting of patrilocal exogamy, so there's very low rates of endogamy, of kind of marrying within extended families or sub-castes. There's no official subcaste system. It's one in which daughters move away from the village. Typically, they move into their husband's household. That's important because that means they almost always end education upon marriage, and that's because, practically speaking, they're switching villages. They'd have to switch schools. There are other possible reasons, but it's just you see that almost always happening. And there's rarely an existing relationship between the parents of the bride and groom, and that's important for the information environment. So it's much more likely to be the case that you don't really know much about the girl that you're marrying your son to, in terms of things as in terms of her attitude and what kind of norms of behavior she's likely to follow. And just to contextualize it a little more, so there's a soccer game going on in the background of my house that you might hear some shouts, but there's no fire. So just to contextualize it a little more, the kind of norms of behavior that we think people are worrying about when we talk about socially conservative, it's, is this going to be a girl that talks directly to men when she's in the shop? Is this a girl that's going to walk outside the village by herself? There's the kind of reputation concerns that you read about in kind of qualitative research on expected behavior of especially young brides that we think are the things that you won't really know about a 16-year-old that you might bring into your household. Almost all marriages have dowry. So 85% of marriages have dowry in our data, and this includes some, so this is likely underreported. So I think kind of universally, I would say there's pretty universal dowry in Bangladesh. And the average value is very high. It's twice what I said. I thought it was 800, and then I thought I can't. It surprises me kind of how much dowry payment there is on marriage. Marriage contracts in Bangladesh are a little bit complicated in that they also involve a pre-negotiated more or den mer, which is an amount, an amount that's traditional in the Muslim marriage contract, which in the case of Bangladesh is almost always a transfer from the groom to the bride only in the event of divorce. So it's kind of a prenuptial amount. And that is in the marriage contract twice as much as the dowry kind of on average. We're gonna abstract away from den mer in our model because it just complicates things enormously. So I won't talk much more about that, but feel free to ask me questions. Average rate of child marriage at baseline is high. It's not the highest in Bangladesh, but 52% of women marry under 18, 26% under 16. It's changing a bit. So when you get, that was rates calculated among kind of older sisters in our data when we entered at our baseline. In our control group, we're going to see rates of underage marriage of more like 40%. So it's, I think right now it's about 40% under age 18.
Erica?
Okay, yeah, yes.
Hey, this is Randall Kuhn. Sorry, I'm in front of the fridge. I was curious if you've thought about Kim Streetfield and others' work on that people aren't really marrying their daughters early, they're just reporting that they marry their daughters early, and that if you use vital registration data, a lot of that effect goes away?
Yeah, certainly there are differences across sources that are large and varying. I think, so you're talking, I think there are many sources of underreporting. We don't see kind of any differences in reporting of marriage age across daughters and parents. And so of course, people could be on exactly the same page in terms of, talking about when they get married. We see big differences between saying when you want to get married and when you actually did that are consistent with, well, let me tell you my best. I'm trying to think of all the reasons that I believe that we can accurately capture marriage age. In our setting, we are, finding girls who are unmarried. And so we'd have to have a pretty complicated system in which people are lying about their age from baseline. So we're getting girls as early as kind of 10, and then we actually see when they marry because we track them for 12 years. So I guess
right. No, I definitely buy the prospective, that you're able to observe it prospectively. It was that baseline that, and I haven't thought
Yeah.
about what the implications of the baseline being that they're over-reporting early marriage.
I think I'd not worried about that just because people said they wanted to be marrying later than they actually are. So when you take our prospective measurement, you know, at baseline, they said they wanted to marry their daughter at 20, but they're actually marrying her at 17. And so I didn't assume there was an over-reporting of underage marriage. Given that, I thought if anything that there would be, at least at this point in time, more pressure to underreport underage marriage, or, you know, lie upwards, because if anything, people are lying about their preferences to us. It was a sense I got. I was more surprised by how late people said they wanted to get married, whether it's the girl or the parent. And that meant, my initial concern was then, oh, people, you know, there's become a stigma to marrying young, which is the opposite of what you're saying. I mean, I guess take preferences with a grain of salt. Yeah, I mean, even, you're right, our baseline data, there is this uncertainty. People could be reporting that incorrectly. So you can take that with a grain of salt. Our girls are marrying at 40% are marrying under 18. And I think we have measured that fairly well.
Right. That's why it struck me that I think it's higher. The incidence is higher in the baseline than in the prospective, which might be picking up some of that. It's
a pretty big age range, though, the baseline, though, because those are girls.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of like there's been a, yeah, you're right. We should caveat that. That's a good point. It could be that.
Thanks.
Okay, so this is a little bit, I've already gotten into some of these details, but yeah.
Can I interject here? I mean, actually, it's on point here. Is there is there, like in many Southeast Asian and Southeast Asian society, it's kind of a double standard, and with respect to sexual behavior and the expectation that women would be the expectation of virginity at time of marriage for women?
There's very much an expectation. I mean, there's no kind of extramarital childbearing or extramarital, you know, sexual activity.
So when you're saying there is no, I assume so you're saying it's still not a concern.
It's highly regulated. Yeah, I mean, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, but girls, yes. And that's one reason that people think, you know, that's one of the primary reasons that people expect there to be a youth premium, why people want to marry young or marry their daughters young, is kind of regulation of female sexuality. I think that is.
Right, but there hasn't been any change over time with respect to that, which could have made the risk, quote unquote, of waiting harder to accept for marrying later. Like the fact that girls are going to school longer, that there's maybe factory works and other social change, that hasn't made that a more, like, waiting a more risky strategy from that point of view.
I mean, I can't rule. I mean, I don't know that I know or can evaluate that with what I've had. I mean, I feel like it's always been, yeah, I mean, it's always been highly stigmatized and highly important. That it's gotten more. I mean, I guess I can think of reasons. It's certainly not so. I don't think it's become more progressive in attitude, so that we don't have any of that going on in the background. You're suggesting something else, which is, I would say, probably more even with kind of information technology, with, you know, smartphone penetration, with people being able to communicate, might make it more difficult to regulate. So if women now, you know, if you can keep women inside the home, or young girls inside the home, but now they can communicate, you know, with boys or get access to other information, that might put pressure on marriage. That's a good point. Again, it's inconsistent with preferences. Preferences over marriage age in what people say they want has increased in terms of what's acceptable. And there have been there's other pressure on social norms, such as, you know, the media, what people read about, what people watch on TV, what the government says you should be doing, has all gone in the other direction. You know, wait, you know, educate yourself. There've been a lot of kind of public messaging around educating girls and waiting until you're above 18. So you're right that there have also been possible concerns that have made underage marriage more valuable. But I guess the important point is, so all of that is I think all of that is encompassed in this kind of, preferences model. Like whatever is going on in terms of preferences, which I don't think we can ever fully observe, they would give rise to certain predictions that don't bear out in our data. And so if your reasons for, wanting to marry your daughter young are because you're worried that she will not be perceived as being pure if she waits, then you have to compensate people for that increased risk. And so that means that if you don't compensate them, they shouldn't marry later. So then you wouldn't get free riding if there's no direct compensation. I think that's sorry, I'm being very long-winded. I think you're absolutely right that all sorts of things could be going on with preferences. And you've brought up one that we didn't mention in our paper and probably should, that there are reasons to actually expect maybe people are holding on to this preference for youth because of changes in usually we assume that there's kind of progress with economic development in terms of norms, but there actually could be a backlash on norms. But I guess that's why it's valuable to derive predictions that pin down the signaling model relative to whatever else might be going on with preferences. But that's a good point. I guess the demographic trends alone could be explained by other factors. Okay. So we mainly tried to distinguish between these two models, that very catch-all preference model, and an environment in which there are signaling and reputation concerns that are complicating marriage timing choices. And again, the reason for that is because you could potentially make use of that by implementing policies that are likely to have a larger effect and be particularly cost effective and welfare improving, so aren't quite as perhaps ethically questionable. So what do we know from survey data about the determinants of marriage age? When parents are asked why a girl shouldn't wait to get married, they do directly mention risk of bad reputation. They also are even more likely to report financial circumstances as influencing marriage timing. On the other hand, there are kind of as I've said many times, there are no stated preference for underage brides. There could be a revealed preference though. People might not say what they really feel because it's stigmatized. And so a lot of people try to infer something about youth premium by looking at dowry with marriage age. So dowry is this nice price we have going on in this particular marriage market, which allows us to do exercises like see how it changes with age of marriage. We do this for every cohort in our data set, and we do see what's often interpreted as a youth premium in the sense that the dowry that a woman pays is increasing steadily with marriage age, and the slope isn't changing too much. It kind of changes at one point in time in terms of the cohorts, but it's a pretty steady, age premium, a youth premium in the marriage market. Of course, these data are, the different women are entering the marriage market at different ages in terms of socioeconomic background. And so the dowry is going to go up with income. And so what we might just be seeing is wealthier people marrying later. To try to disentangle that, we also conduct a slightly more complicated survey exercise with matchmakers. So we interview all of the matchmakers in our study sample areas. And this is the data set of close to 1,000 matchmakers operating in these 3 sub-districts. And what we do here is a hypothetical vignette survey question where we say, here are 2 people, they've been matched, they're agreed to marry. How much more dowry does this woman have to pay or this girl if she waits another year? And we try very hard in the vignette to hold everything else constant. It's really hard to do even in a hypothetical because the question is like, why is she going to wait? What is her financial circumstance changing? Is she, so we're really trying to kind of hold the girl constant. And that allows us to do kind of a more careful, calculate a more careful age premium. And what you see, so the first on the left-hand side, you see exactly this, like how does the blue is the dowry, how does the dowry change as the exact same couple just waits a year to marry? And you do see there is, the matchmakers say, and they're the ones negotiating these prices, that in fact, she does have to pay a little more if she waits. But it's not quite as steep as if you just look at the raw data. What's ambiguous about this is if you look at this thing that I told you, you wouldn't have to think about again, but if you look at this den mer amount, this prenuptial amount, that's also going up. And so anecdotally, what they say is that when you marry a girl later, it's also the marriage is riskier. And there are all sorts of possible reasons for that. But the fact is they're getting more insurance. And so we actually don't even know if it's an age premium in the marriage market, because maybe she's just buying more prenuptial insurance. It's much more clear if you look at education. So you do the exact same exercise with education, which is also an important premise of our model. So that's why I'm bringing it in here. You do actually see that education is highly valued on the marriage market. That is, if you take the exact same girl married to the exact same boy and educate her a year more, she pays less and less dowry and she gets more and more insurance. And so it's unambiguously good to be educated if you're a girl. Again, this is something we're assuming in our model. And it's also something that's kind of interesting because in settings like Bangladesh, there was a lot of debate about whether education actually helps or hurts a girl on the marriage market for a long time. And it seems, according to Matchmakers, everyone prefers it if the girl is more educated.
Erica, so this is education, I guess, holding age fixed. If I kind of add these together, if I have a 16-year-old daughter, I just want to minimize dowry, is it better to send her to school for a year or to marry her off?
That is a good question. I don't know if I want to do that on the spot, given that I can actually barely read the numbers.
Yeah, no worries. I thought you might know, but if not, don't worry about it.
Good idea. We should do that calculation. I guess the whole, I will definitely do that calculation. It's putting a lot of faith in kind of the exact numbers that these matchmakers are reporting, but that's a great idea. Okay, so we need more, this is all to say that we need more nuanced predictions and a field experiment to know exactly what's going on with age, to establish there is an age premium. Okay, so we write down a very stylized model of the marriage market in which we have two choices of the bride. She can marry, or the parents of the bride are deciding whether to marry their daughter early or late. And we assume they go to school until they marry. So early marriage also means low education. They can get high education, low education, marry early or marry late. Education is valued on the marriage market, but it's not the dominant bride characteristic. What dominates in the marriage market for brides is social conservatism, is obedience to gender norms. So if they marry early, then, in period one, at the early period, an unmarried woman decides who's either high type or low type, is either conservative or not conservative, to enter the marriage market with low education. At that point, men make dowry offers to the available women. A woman, if she receives an offer and accepts it, she pays the dowry and exits the market. In the second period, the late marriage period, those who are still unmarried so we're allowing people to never get married, although that is fairly low still in the data. They may decide to enter the market with high education. Unmarried, the men who are still unmarried make dowry offers to those women, and if they accept it, they pay the dowry and marry and exit. And she stays unmarried otherwise. And so the key insights of the model are very simple. Basically, in our model, under certain circumstances, women will pool on early marriage. And that is because men believe the later entrants in our stylized world are low types for sure. They have higher marginal returns from education. Since submissiveness is first order, or conservatism is first order in marriage, the men are going to charge a significantly higher dowry if she's a low type for sure, even if she has a high education. So that's why the dominant, that's why docility dominating education is key in the model. It's kind of like the question Natalie asked before, if education is more important, then we wouldn't get these predictions. So the low types are going to prefer pooling with the high on early marriage and receiving low education to delaying marriage, even though everyone in our world, we've assumed that everyone would prefer marrying later because of the education. The only assumption we're really making is that everyone wants a more educated bride. Brides want to educate themselves more. And so it would be a Pareto improvement if we could coordinate on a higher marriage, but there's always going to be this incentive to deviate among the preferred types just to reveal that they're preferred. We assume there's no screening menu. There could be under certain circumstances, but all we're trying to establish here is that if you're in a situation in which a screening menu is not possible, and that could be because of a liquidity constraint. So if the preference difference is enough that the dowry difference would be high enough, then you would not be able to pool if there's a liquidity constraint. And the dowries, as I've shown you, are high. So that seems reasonable. And then the second main insight of this is that, so we'll get pooling, and we could get pooling if the right conditions hold. And if they do, and we're in a pooling equilibrium, then a small conditional on marriage only transfer can cause everyone, the treated and the untreated, to delay marriage under certain circumstances. So first, it has to be the untreated women to delay. It would have to be the case that it's not perfectly observed who gets the incentive and who doesn't. Because what they're doing is sort of pretending to be eligible for the incentive as an excuse for marrying later. That's what allows them to hide their type. If you can know exactly if there's a register of who gets the incentive and who doesn't, then this wouldn't work. So there has to be some ambiguity about who is eligible for the incentive. It also has to be an incentive that's offered independent of type. So that's why it can't be conditional on education. It has to be, so we do that by randomizing the incentive. But if you offer an incentive to, to less conservative girls, that would really fail, because they would reveal their type by accepting the incentive, or people would know it's only for them. Also, if you do that based on education, but if it's random, or if it's done across space or across cohorts or something that's independent of type, then you can achieve this as long as there's some ambiguity about who's eligible and who's not in the marriage market. Basically, if men know that all types, all women, regardless of type, have an extra incentive to marry later, then you can achieve this. And that's because the only women don't, in our model, the only reason that women don't delay in the status quo is because that would for sure signal their low type. Although it really is a very simple model. So, okay. So the testable predictions that we bring to our field experiment are that a conditional incentive, conditional only on delaying marriage, is going to delay marriage timing and increase education among treated women of both preferred and non-preferred types. And then we will also see spillovers for those women for whom it's ambiguous whether or not they were eligible, but only on the low types, only on the progressive types of women. It's a fully separating equilibrium is still not going to be feasible, and that's because we're not assuming the transfer eases the liquidity constraint for the treated. So that's kind of a key technical detail. I'll skip those. And then another prediction that we bring to the data is that the treated women will pay a weekly smaller dowry and not have lower marriage qualities than untreated women. And then we also test a prediction through the empowerment program that an increase in the fraction of non-preferred types, so if you change the number of girls on the market who are have progressive gender norms, then we should see a decrease in the marriage, a weak decrease in the marriage and education of all types. All right, so let me tell you how we test these predictions. We introduce two types of programs into 3 sub-districts of rural Bangladesh and evaluate them with an RCT. So we randomize villages into one of the 4 treatment arms that receive either the empowerment program, the conditional incentive program, the combination of the 2, or remain pure control. And we stratify at the union level, which is a collection of approximately, in our sub-districts, 5 villages. And so we randomize so that we have balance across the unions. The incentive program is delivered in kind, and that is not because there are any particular obvious advantages to in-kind transfers. In fact, cash is the most straightforward type of transfer, although it wasn't in the environment when we implemented this program. So the distribution system was already in place for delivering cooking oil, which is highly liquid in more ways than one. It's something that all households use regularly, purchase regularly on the market, and so it has essentially cash value in this setting. And they were delivering cooking oil to pregnant women in this who are not part of our study. They were finishing an oil distribution program to pregnant women when we started this study. And so that the infrastructure was in place. I think it'd be even easier to set this kind of program up now that there are so many kind of electronic bank transfers that are possible, even to the very rural Bangladesh. The most complicated part, and this is going to be true in any kind of scale up of a program like this, is ensuring that people are actually ensuring that marital status is measured with accuracy. We did that in our study areas by essentially, we did an audit study of girls, arriving at girls' parents' homes and finding them in the house. Again, because the vast majority of girls are always moving in with their the groom's family upon marriage, and that's in the majority of cases well outside the village. A spot check of whether she's living with her parents is a fairly good proxy for whether or not she's married, especially if you think about whether or not she's effectively married. So that is like one thing that happens periodically is that people have have a period of staying with their parents after marriage, and they often do that to complete school. They could be increasing that. That's usually a period of only up to 2 months. They could be increasing that in response to this as a means of lying. And we decided that that's fine in the sense that they still then get all the benefits of remaining unmarried if they're marrying and then staying with their parents and staying in school. But we also, in addition, asked community health workers, asked neighbors and teachers in the school who had married every month and kept track of that, and also checked registers for marriage. But people, that's definitely not always done immediately after marriage. Some people never register their marriage, and some people wait years, and so that's not necessarily the best check. But we used a variety of approaches to ensure that people people's eligibility card for the incentive were taken away upon marriage. And then what we can do with the data at end line, which is when girls are 25, is test whether or not we took cards away in an accurate manner. And so we have we did a very good job of capturing marriage in real time, at least within a 4-month period. Right, this is a picture of a distribution. Yes.
Erica, sorry, this is Randall. So
yes, Randall.
So that is, if the daughter was present, then it wasn't just merely her presence in the household. It was you also asked.
We did all these checks of everyone, unless they told us they were married. We didn't question that ever. Unless,
okay. Yeah. Okay, perfect.
All right, so we once every 4 months, we set up a distribution a distribution center in the center of the village, and girls themselves had to show up with their eligibility cards that were taken away when they were married. The empowerment program, we borrowed kind of the BRAC curriculum. It was implemented by Save the Children Bangladesh, but it's a curriculum that's been implemented throughout the world, and they and we as researchers wanted very much to kind of evaluate the most standard program that's it's implemented in practice now. It is a bundle. It is, includes a lot of lessons on negotiation, including role playing, reproductive health, hard information on legal rights, on reproductive health, nutrition, health-seeking behavior, and financial literacy was piloted in some villages and not others. It was a very intensive program. So girls met 6 days a week for 1.5 hours over 6 months. And the project lasted up to 4 cycles, depending on the village size. So it was always kept at less than 20 girls per cycle. This is kind of what an empowerment program looked like in practice. The first step in implementing the empowerment program was identifying a safe space that all girls could attend. And that was generally, if there was a community center in the village, if it was a big village, then there would be some kind of public space that could be utilized for this. It was never in the schools because we really wanted it to be kind of separate from school. And so there was no kind of confusion about having to be in school to participate in this. But it was very often in the wealthiest person's house. I mean, someone in the village would have a house with this kind of space that could accommodate up to 20 girls. And it was surprisingly not hard to get communities to participate. So I think of all the communities we approached, I think there were 4 or 5 that opted out, that refused to hold an empowerment program. And yeah, so there was a fair amount of acceptance of the program. There was a large step at the beginning of kind of getting the community leaders on board and accomplishing that, but they managed to. We evaluate this with a baseline done immediately prior to the start of both of these programs, and then conducted a midline kind of the year after the programs ended. So the intervention took place 2000. So the census was 2007. The baseline was 2008. The program was implemented 2009 and 10, and the midline was conducted in 2011. And then we conducted an end line 5 years later, by which time most girls were married. So the midline gives us really good information on underage marriage, but we still don't know marriage age, and the end line gives us better information on marriage age. The take-up was very high. This is a really complicated slide to read, so even I'm having trouble. The empowerment, 85 to 90% of girls were enrolled. And the incentive, you want to look at the administrative data suggests that the take-up was 92%. And so even 8% not taking up kind of something on the table is a little bit surprising, but I think those were usually cases in which the family was away, there was, the girl was traveling and couldn't be there for the program. And our tracking, so I'm going to show you a couple of subsample results, but tracking was not particularly hard, even though this is a hard age to track, because the data I'm going to show you come from parents. And parents at that age, parents of girls who have married, are very unlikely to move away from the village. The only difficulty we had with tracking was 4% of the sample was in a small subset of villages that were entirely washed out because of cyclones in the middle of this period. There was some kind of drop of survey refusal. And then there was a lot of, the 19% is kind of the highest. This is just, you won't kind of see this in the study sample. We had to change the analysis sample because we enrolled unmarried girls 15 to 17, but then a lot of them got married kind of between doing the baseline and starting the program. Okay, but attrition is relatively low. So that didn't belong in here, sorry. Bullet, ignore the first bullet. We use a really standard experimental estimate in which I'm going to show you the separate impact of the empowerment and the incentive and whether or not there's any interaction effect. As I said before, this is look at the means in the second column. 40% of our control group are marrying under 18 and 16% under 16. I'm speed through, but just stop me if you want me to dwell on any of these. I just want to get through the result. And
hi, Erica. Yeah, I had a quick question. Yep. So the age at treatment for all these girls is the same, or are they different ages? They're different ages.
So what we did was enroll all girls in incentive villages. So empowerment is any girl, effectively it was any girl who wants to come. But all girls who were 10 to 18 in the empowerment villages were invited to participate. That is, only those who were 10 to 18 were enrolled, but I don't think people stopped anyone from coming. The incentive was girls 15 to 17 at the start of the program. And they were only eligible until they turned 18. So this is really important for evaluating the effect sizes we find, because a lot of our treatment girls are only eligible for one cycle of oil. So there's the maximal program effect is highly dependent on the age of enrollment, and that varies continuously between 24, well, yeah, between 24 months and 3 months, or 24 months and 4 months. And so I'll say more about that, but yeah, you had to be between 15 and 17, and you became unenrolled upon turning 18 or getting married.
Thank you.
Okay. So as I said, we're interested in the program impact of the empowerment program on girls' gender norms, and we have an index of gender norms measured at baseline and then again at end line, the same questions. And these are, I think we have 10 questions that ask, a lot of them are taken from the World Values Survey. A lot of them are specific to Bangladesh, but they ask things like, when jobs are scarce, should women be given jobs before men? Should, what are the other ones? Should men be served dinner before their wives eat? Oh, we had, so the one specific, we did a lot of piloting to try to, we were very interested in kind of capturing what in this particular environment is the difference between a girl who's kind of outspoken and a girl who's very traditional. And, you know, it really changes over time and you know, across context. And it's hard to know for efficiency purposes, like what survey question is going to really capture that, you know, in our population. And it's true that when you talk to people, so our first question of families in piloting our survey instrument and collecting qualitative data was kind of, you know, we're interested in, there are different types of girls. Some girls are really outspoken, some, you know, speak their mind, even if it's going to make some people mad. Other girls, you know, care most about what their parents think. And people understood this. I mean, there was first of all acknowledgement that, yeah, there's that type, there's the difficult type, and there's the, you know, obedient type. But the kind of questions that worked that we ended up putting in our survey was like, you know, it's okay for a girl to wear makeup when she wants to. No one should tell a girl what to wear. Those are kind of the distinguishing questions in our qualitative research with girls. So we have some a little bit kind of non-standard questions that we thought captured that sentiment well, and there was a lot of variation, like kind of within the village. And then we have some world values survey questions about gender norms. Okay, so empowerment program, but not the incentive, reduced a girl's kind of conservative gender norms. And then we look at marriage. What we see is, you know, kind of interested in the first row for looking at the effect of the empowerment program, and the second row measures the average effect on underage marriage of the incentive. I'm going to close the door. I'm sorry, I have some background noise.
Erica, before you continue with this slide, if you go back, how big is the effect?
How big is the effect on conservative values?
Yeah,
how
should I interpret this? No, on values.
And it's not, so this is an index measured in terms of standard deviation, so this is not an enormous effect. You know, I think it's, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so but the underage marriage, I guess on the other hand, is a large effect in percentage terms. So let me just first note for interpretation, one confusing thing in our sample, and that is because we enrolled girls who were unmarried between 15 and 17, the rate of underage marriage is significantly lower in our analysis sample than in the population, because a lot of, you know, girls who were still unmarried at 17 are the late marriage girls on average. And so the control mean in our analysis sample, that is girls between 15 and 17 who participated in the program, is 30%. And the impact of the incentive on girls who were 15 to 17 in column 1 is a 4.9 percentage point reduction in age of marriage, or kind of a 20% reduction in the rate of underage marriage. We divide in, you know, we're alternating across columns, looking at the subsample of girls eligible for 2 years versus those eligible for any amount of time. And that's just precisely because of what I said before, that you know, the potential program effects on the later age girls are going to be much lower. So there's a big dose response that's somewhat mechanical in our setting. But in general, you would expect larger effect sizes on girls who are younger, who stay in the program for 2 years. But it's also a smaller sample of girls. We see similar, you know, significant effects on very underage marriage, but there we have, because we gave the incentive to older girls, we have very little opportunity to observe a change in marriage under 16. And so those are noisier effect sizes. And that's why it's only, we can only look at girls who are 15 at program enrollment.
Erica, sorry, yeah. For how long do you observe them after the program?
So the program ended, we're seeing girls like basically at age 25, I think it's 23 to 27. No, sorry, 23. It's either 23 to 25 or 25 to 27.
Okay.
So I can figure that out.
So my question would be on the outcome ever married at end line, I guess, that you find that it could be reducing the chances for them to ever get married.
Well, we double check that. So, one sort of surprising thing is that we have such high rates of not married. I don't want to say never married because they're still in their 20s, but of not married at end line. It's not at midline. You don't expect, so at midline, you expect to see an effect on ever married because they're still young enough. Midline is right after the program ends. So they're 18, 19, 20. And so there you might still see a difference. You should see a difference in whether or not they're married. At end line, you would expect everyone to be married. That's what we thought might be true, or almost everyone, or at least, hope for convergence, because the program, maybe not of empowerment if there were age effects on empowerment, but of the incentive ends when you're 18. So in fact, it looks like there are program effects that outlast the program, but they converge by the time we observe them when they're in their mid-20s. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, well, this point estimate of negative 0.26, I guess, on the age 15, column 7.
Yes. That is midline. So that's when they're 19. So this is not
column 7. Column 7, yeah.
Oh, at end line. I was looking at this. This is 0.26 okay. Also.
It's the same, yeah.
Column 7. Yeah. I had not. I had treated that as noisy and insignificant. It's a large point estimate. You're right. I mean,
because can we see the
important thing to bring up now? Maybe is that which is that, or what I just said, that we do see program effects that don't make sense. They're certainly outside the scope of our model at ages 20 and 22. And, I don't have an answer for that. I think there are two possible stories that we don't have, right now, a clear ability to test, but one would just be search frictions. People could search before they marry, but maybe they don't, maybe in practice they don't. There could also be there could be it could be that in getting a girl to delay to 18, which should be the choice parents are making, you're giving them money until they're 18, and the ones who change should be the ones who were gonna marry earlier. But maybe in doing that, you educate the girl and she has suddenly more expansive opportunities or more negotiating power, and that allows her to kind of, postpone even more. It's really interesting to me, and obviously important for policy reasons, and is a part of the average program effect we measure are effects that are beyond the life of the program, if that makes clear. And so given that we have that, it's certainly not part of the model's predictions, but given that we see that, I guess there's no reason we wouldn't see that also at end line. As it turns out, it's significant at midline, but not end line. So it looks like it's converging, but you might look at it differently and look like it's not. So yes, that's happening certainly before 25, and maybe it's even still happening at 25, although it's not significant.
Erica, can you see? Oh, sorry, Randall. Erica, can you see if the incentive program changes women's preferences at all? Like, do these girls who get more education then have sort of less preference to get married, or the empowerment outcomes look different? Yeah,
so we don't see it there, but we could certainly look at a lot more data on this. So this is gender norms, and I don't even. It's fine. This is kind of the last thing we ever did that we kind of weren't building into our original. So I don't even know exactly what the index components look like, and we haven't. Actually, we have a separate paper that evaluates in detail the empowerment program and kind of tries to learn about the more nuanced effects of empowerment. And that changes your aspirations in all sorts of ways. I don't know that we've actually looked very carefully at the incentive effects on aspirations. We are in the process now, but that's a bit, so I am definitely intrigued by that. I can't tell you right now what it is.
Erica, I guess my concern about the end line is not so much with the program effects as with the baseline mean. That I feel like if you have full coverage of marriages, it should be well into the 90s. And it just, I guess it would raise it feels like you want to head off a potential question that there's some sort of set of marriages that went unrecorded. I don't know how that would happen in this prospective design.
Sorry, you're talking about column 6 and 7? The mean?
Yeah, that the mean should be, that the mean proportion married by age 25 should be 90-something%.
Yeah, that's certainly what we predicted. And you know, those predictions are based on older cohorts, obviously, and based on, in general, not this, you know, not these three subject districts. Certainly, we can't even, you know, I guess one could see these sub districts in the DHS, but we've always looked for, done our projections based on, you know, maybe in Barisal, you know, the average and of an older cohort. So we are surprised. These are parents' reports. So and I always thought unmarried, you know. Yeah, it's hard to imagine why people would not say their daughter was married. Yeah, I mean, do you have thoughts about why we might get people underreporting marriage? We did take that at face value.
This is literally a direct question. Is your daughter married?
Yeah, marital status, divorced, separated, widowed. So it wasn't just, because unmarried could mean separated and divorced and widowed. Maybe the stigma on that, maybe the stigma on divorce. But it's so, I mean.
Right, that they had really short marriages and
that's reported as never married.
Erica, but is it actually that low when you think about the selection? Because we shouldn't see the population average, right? Because you've dropped out all the early marrying people. So mechanically, this is like a population that has a much later average marriage age than like the total population. So
I mean, that's certainly important. We could still do that projection from the DHS, you know, looking at, like, if you looked at people, you know, who were married, like what would they, how many of them? And this was lower than we expected. But if Randall's not thinking, I mean, that is that selection is gonna, you know, push us towards more never married. That is that we're talking about girls who weren't married by 17. So their rate of never marriage is higher. But it is still lower than we expected. I should think about, I mean, we could certainly, because we could compare this with the registry data, because we have collected that and we will collect it again. So unless the same girls, you know, were never registered, I guess we wouldn't see the same pattern. Would that be more convincing to you? Or does that sound like a reasonable way to explore that possibility?
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to know. I'm going to think about that more.
Okay. Yeah, please let me, if you have thoughts about it.
I mean, it could be a unique pattern, but it's not an area that's known for, say, long delay of marriage, which this would entail.
Yeah. I mean, you'll also see, I guess I think I have it here. No, so underage births correspond to the marriage results in a not surprising way. So there are fewer underage births. The education, there are more girls that are also still in school at Enline. So 28% on average of girls are still in some kind of post-secondary schooling, which is way more than the post-secondary schooling rate that we ever imagined, especially among them. If you look at this, even among just married girls, so many married girls are in some kind of post-secondary schooling. So that's another demographic pattern that we didn't expect. A lot of this is you know, very part-time vocational courses that you can actually see them when you're in the region, like these kind of very shoddy schools that have popped up all over the place. And so it has been a huge demographic change that girls are doing courses even at age 23, 24. I don't know how that relates possibly to, you know, not being married, but that is another demographic pattern that was surprising and interesting to us, although we don't have more to say about that because we weren't.
The obvious thing is in fact to do what you said you're going to do, and that is to do the projection of the total population, including all the girls who were not in the study because they were already married by age 16. And if you have a rapid social change, it could well be that by the time that the girls who are not married, by the time they would have entered the sample, are in fact not marrying at nearly the same rates as girls from earlier cohorts who got to that age without marrying, and they're in, as you say, they're much more likely to be in school, perhaps much more likely to be in school than the earlier cohorts, and so that may be what you're observing. Is rapid social change, and it's easy enough to determine whether what you're overall rate is by doing the calculation with the girls who are already married by the time that, and therefore are not eligible for the sample.
In terms of marriage, yeah, we don't have the ones who are already married. We know when they got married, or we know that they married early. We don't know a lot. We don't know things like schooling for them, and we haven't been tracking girls outside the age range. But yeah, we can certainly compare.
Well, you certainly know that they have. I mean, from what you've said before, you know that they don't continue in school after they're married. So you can make the assumption about their amount of schooling just from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to point out in this graph, that that's certainly true in terms of full-time student enrolled in, the local secondary school or primary school. What's not true is that what's different is that assumption in our model that simplifies things greatly is not fully consistent with this other type of post-secondary schooling that's happening now in this environment. And that's, which is that's what's, most people are married, 90% of people are married, and 30% of them are still in school at age 25. So that is, I want to point out, an inconsistency with, what we assume, but that's because these are vocational schools that are, courses people are taking, not kind of full-time studies. But
and that is you've observed that this is not formal schooling.
It's not. We separated it. The survey asked about that. We don't know what they're studying. We're going back actually as soon as we can. It's been delayed, and we will ask many more questions about what they're studying. And just I'm kind of fascinated by all of these kind of dodgy post-secondary schooling investments that people are making and trying to calculate the returns to them. But so we will know more about that. But that is happening in the background.
Erica, I just want to give you a 10-minute warning.
Yep. All right, I have 7 more slides, so let me just move on. Yeah, and this is just the distribution across treatment arms. So what we find, so here, the one thing I didn't point out is that the empowerment program seems to have some education effects that aren't quite as robust and smaller in magnitude. Those things go hand in hand. But it looks like empowerment is influencing not marriage age. That's pretty, small and robustly insignificant. But there seem to be schooling effects of empowerment, but not marriage. Now, what we see based on, I'm not going to ask you to follow this now, but just kind of trust my explanation of how to put those things together. It looks like empowerment is leading girls who were dropping out of school slightly before getting married, like a year or two, a year before getting married, to stay in school all the way up until they can, up until the last minute. It's not endowing them with the negotiating power to change their marriage age, which is also not surprising in a setting in which most girls are not even told that they're getting married until shortly before it happens. Certainly not asked, they don't have much veto power, at least according to their own reports. But they do seem to have some ability to take their skills or their excitement or their will that from the participation in the empowerment program and bargain for more education up until the time they're married. Again, that departs a bit from the simplicity of our model. But you see that in the timing of when the school differences are emerging. Whereas the girls in the incentive program, the ones that were able to push out their marriage age are staying in school longer kind of mechanically as they occupy themselves with extra time. So it's kind of a different, I guess, what I want to say is in terms of education policy, these are not substitutes. These are not, first of all, they're not substitutes for marriage age policy because only the incentive is changing marriage age. They're both changing education, and you can see that here. But so the empowerment is the red line, and the incentive is the control is the blue. And the other three are the 3 different kinds of treatments, the combined and the incentive empowerment. They're all shifting rightward the distribution of education years, but they're operating on different subsets of the population. And I think that's interesting for policy. This is what I was telling you about the marriage market characteristics. The key result here is that the dowry effects of the incentive are insignificant. And of the treatment arms are all kind of insignificant, and that we don't have great data on husbands because we asked parents, not parents of the grooms, but parents of the brides, about the spouse that their daughter married, and so they, it's not the best respondent for detailed information about the husband's character or even activities. But we asked if he is has a salary job. That's what income generation is, and his age and his education. And also whether or not he lived outside the community. At the last column is outside the upazila. Community here is village. And as I said before, so 90%, most people are marrying outside the village, but most people are marrying inside the subset of not the upazila is not the union. So the upazila is, and we don't see any change in the spatial distribution of marriages or in observable indicators of husband quality. The spillover effects we observe are, oh my gosh, sorry. I just asked my co-author to replace the slide today and she took away the result. It's in the paper. Sorry, that I really should have double checked the slide. From the parent survey, you can see in the first case that those who live geographically close to the boundary of the incentive village, who are 15 to 17, so look at column 1, are also significantly less likely to marry under age 18, which is the outcome that's not even on this slide. This is whether or not you marry under age 18. And so girls under ages 15 to 17 that are within half a kilometer of the village border of an incentive village appear to be free riding in terms of marrying later, even though they're not eligible for the incentive. This is importantly a setting where there's pretty continuous population density. And so there really is genuine kind of ambiguity about the exact location of the village boundaries. And that became very salient to us as we were drawing the village boundaries. So the first thing we had to do in this environment, in which we identified villages in the census, but then we had to draw the village boundaries to enroll people in the various programs. And there was a lot of dispute about which kind of household are in which village A or village B. We certainly misclassified some people according to their own feelings about it, at least when the program was introduced. And so there was a lot of arguing, why don't we get an incentive card? And so that whole process is what made us think that this is exactly the type of environment in which we would expect certain girls to free ride on that ambiguity. And that motivated us to test this prediction. But it is, I think, believable that you would be able to pretend you were part of the incentive program, even if you weren't, if you're that close to the incentive village. What you don't see in columns 5 and 6 that is a key prediction is that all of those, when we classify girls according to their baseline level of conservatism, and we divide it by the median level, you see that all of these program effects that you see in column 1 are only observed on those that have low levels of conservatism. And there's no spillover effects on the conservative type of girls. Okay, so just to conclude, and the middle columns were only to say that that's not true of the direct effects of the program. So there you see, indistinguishable responses to the program by type. And that's only the spillover effects vary by type. Okay, so just in conclusion, we believe that this pattern of results provides evidence that the signaling environment or signaling considerations or reputation concerns are contributing to the levels and the patterns over time of child marriage in this setting. And that it is therefore plausible and makes sense that people's preferences would be changing and they would be desiring to marry and marry later, but still actually be stuck in a low marriage age equilibrium. If that's the case, then it's not necessarily the right program prescription to try to directly target at least girls' preferences. And in doing so, it's even possible that you could put more downward pressure on marriage age. On the other hand, if signaling considerations are important enough, then there's even higher potential for a relatively small financial incentive to have a big effect in coordinating a high marriage age equilibrium in this environment, or reducing child marriage and increasing female schooling as a result. And that could last even beyond the life of the program, even though we can't fully say why. So that makes it even more cost effective in this setting. And I'm not going to go, we have kind of, there's a lot we can say about policy based on the model in terms of what's the optimal, in terms of cost efficacy, the amount of coverage that would maximize the program effect, the optimal size of the transfer. But given the time, I am going to end now, since I've said most of what I want to say, and I'd love to hear any more comments from any of you, because these have been so helpful.
Thanks so much, Erica. This has been great. Maybe we have time for just like 1 or 2 questions, because I'm very cognizant that you're meeting with the PhD students after this, so we don't want to eat too much into their time. Does anyone, so there's maybe one last person want to give a question or comment to Erica?
I have a short question. I think it would be helpful because of the last results on the amount of dowry and the quality of the husband that are unclear, especially the dowry. I was wondering if you could tell us something about the characterizing the compliers, like who are the girls that would most benefit from providing this financial incentive in terms of their likelihood of staying unmarried longer. It would have to be the case that if we see a decrease in the dowry, the incentive would be shifting high types rather than low types, but your evidence doesn't seem to corroborate that, right? Did I understand that right?
The prediction of the model is that the incentive should change the marriage age of everybody, because we're assuming everybody wants to get educated. I mean, again, like if you relax those assumptions, things are going to look not so clean. Those assumptions are not going to apply to everybody. So that, I don't know how valuable that prediction is, but because everyone values education, and because education is costless, that sounds like a radical assumption. It's not a radical assumption in this environment where schooling is free for girls, and there's even a stipend that most people are eligible for and receive some form of. And so it's really not, it's not, but in that simple environment, then everybody would shift regardless of type. But maybe you're thinking of a more subtle prediction in a more complicated model. Or everyone should respond.
Right.
If it's not known who gets it. I mean, like no one will, yeah. I mean, if you know who gets it, then only, you're not going to get any response unless it's big enough, yeah. But if you can capitalize on the ambiguity of what type you are, then you should get everyone responding. Or you could if it was big enough, okay, above a certain threshold.
Okay.
But I mean, obviously, yeah, I mean, we have very overly simple predictions from an overly simple model. And so it's just, we're only shifting from everyone's pooling, and we're shifting from low to high. I think to generate more, to make use of the richer variation we have in our sample, we'd have to have a much more complex model. And that might be worth doing.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, in terms of characterizing the compliers, we'd have to make some prediction and test that. And the kind of predictions we have tested are, having an older sister makes you less constrained and, less likely to marry early. And so you're actually less responsive. But I think that makes sense based on what we know about that constraint and the age, the importance of ordering daughters' marriages. So we've looked at for patterns like that, for the most part, I'm trying to think if there are any others. An important one is that the size of the effect is independent of socioeconomic status. And that we also take as evidence that it's not compensation, because the size of the incentive is the same, but the value of the incentive should be higher for poorer families, and we don't see a disproportionate response of poorer families. So we've looked for some predictions like that, but
okay, awesome. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. I think we've run out of time, but I know that we have a few students here, and I really want to, first of all, I want to say thank you, Dr. Field, for being here and presenting. This was a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I know we have 3 students that have signed up for the pro seminar. So if you could please stay on this same Zoom link, do not go to a different Zoom link. We're going to be using the same Zoom link for the pro seminar. So I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.